Hot take, Lizardmen are boring. Not because they're weak, but because they're so complete that the campaign rarely asks you to solve interesting problems. Welcome to G-Man Gaming and Reviews. Today we're going to talk about why Lizardmen are kinda the most boring faction in Total War Warhammer 3. Let's get into it. So, we're going to first define boring. There's basically 4 bullet points that I have here for boring. The first thing is low early tension. There is very little risk or decision pressure in turns 1 to 30, which makes them remarkably different from most of the other factions in the game. Most of the other factions have glaring weaknesses that you have to work around, especially in the early campaign, or you can, especially on higher difficulty levels, or you can get completely destroyed. They have very few roster gaps, which means there's no need to improvise counters or cheese. They have a very linear power curve in that the same answers that work in the early game work in the mid and the late game as well for the most part, and campaign mechanics just add numbers, not decisions. So next we're going to talk about their early game. So the early game has no hurdle to clear, right? So first you have the Saurus stat stick wall. The Sauri have amazing base melee stats, high armor, leadership. They win most line fights with minimal micro. Early access to skirmish in the type of skinks and chameleons, plus armor piercing dinos. You already have the tools for every enemy type. Your Bastard Lodon, Solar Engine, and Stegadon give you artillery-like ranged punch in the early to mid, so you're not forced into risky siege plays. And you have magical supremacy out of the gate with the Slan, the Law of Life, Heavens, and High magic. So you have safer battles and fewer comebacks needed. Next we move on to their roster. It is just too good problem. Now, to be fair, this isn't something that I'm going to say, because even in the original tabletop game, the Lizardmen in some regards were actually considered too good. But in the game of Total War Warhammer 3, they have answers to everything. They have shields, they have armor, they have mass large, anti-large, terror, poison, stealth, skirmishes, artillery analogs, flyers, monstrous cav, and elite halberds in the Temple Guard. You have the auto-resolve bias, which often favors you because you have tanky frontlines plus monsters, reducing the incentive to manually fight interesting battles. And then you have dino doom stacks that just trivialize many matchups once online. Then we're also going to talk about the campaign mechanics, where you have more numbers than actual choices. So the Geomantic Web is mostly a buff slider gameplay, which is about optimizing provinces and then forget. Rarely changes your strategic route. Blessed spawnings / sacred units. Because of the high rolls that remove scarcity. So if you need anti-large, just spawn it. So, I mean, a lot of people will just spawn the sacred units, but you're better off just having them there to replenish your armies as you need to. And they're so good. They're like, even though you can't recruit them endlessly like the Empire can recruit their regiments of renown, the fact that you can spawn such large numbers early on really means that in the early game it just becomes even easier. And then you've got the rites. Sotek, Primeval Glory. They have huge power. They basically huge power injections on timers, not dilemmas that force trade-offs. And then you have the technology tree. Broad linear gains, few this or that forks that define a run. So next we're going to talk about map and start positions. They're just safe and comfy. Many Lizardmen starts have defensible geography, jungle choke points, and nearby climate they like, lowering expansion friction. The public order econ are forgiving once web commandments settle in, less governor juggling, fewer rebellions to manage. And the battle gameplay loop is just solved early. You know, you have the template fight. So you have Saurus hold, chameleons and salamanders harass, dinos and ancient stegs plus magic delete priority targets. Their micro ceiling is significantly lower than, example, the glass cannon elves or the squishy Skaven or combined arm factions that need coordinated timings. And sieges just get answered by solar engines / stegs plus magic. No need for creative breach plans. So we're going to talk about comparisons and why others feel spicier. So first we have the Tomb Kings, where we have tight economy and army caps forced project choices. We have the Beastmen with the Herdstone AP mechanics push aggressive time box play. The Vampire Coast with gunline angles, ammo and summons making positioning puzzles every battle. The Skaven with fragile power spikes, food tech, and debt dilemmas. In fact, learning to play the Skaven was actually what was incredibly difficult, but one of the really most rewarding things that made the faction so fun, because their playstyle was so different, and you had to literally play to their strengths in order to win. Which, when I first encountered them, I thought they were crap, but they actually are a lot of fun. And then you have the Warriors of Chaos, who they have marked rosters and vassal juggling create divergent runs, but it's not just that. The rosters in the case of the Warriors of Chaos can be incredibly unique depending upon which lord you're playing to make the gameplay experience really different. So we'll talk about some counterpoints, to be fair. So there is a high skill ceiling exists with Skink kite and terror kiting and comet timings and multi-dino micro, right? There is subfaction variety. There's Mazda's Magic Spam and Kropgar's Monster Rush, and the Kai's Horde puzzle can feel different. And style matters. Some players enjoy the power fantasy of a rock-solid army that just works, right? So in order to make the Lizardmen interesting, some self-imposed spice, you could try a no Saurus challenge. So Skinks, dinos, chameleon ambush plays, no artillery analogs, no solar engine steg shooty, win sieges via maneuver / summons. Geomantic Web balls only expand along web nodes, route planning becomes a puzzle. Right restrictions use rites only on crisis / major wars. Theme lists, Sotek Poison Swarm, Cold One Cavalry focus, sacred spawning only. Manual every battle, decision threshold, ban auto resolve on field fights. Now, when we talk about counterpoints, one thing that I will say is, you may say, some people may say that the dwarfs are boring. And to be fair, they can be, but the dwarfs have one major weakness in that they have no cav. The dwarfs really, for the most part, have no fast-moving elements, which can actually mean that which is why they're not, the fact that even though the Lizardmen don't have the same amount of artillery and ranged units that the dwarfs have, the fact that they have cavalry units and flying monsters, not flying monsters, but they have dinos, means that they're a lot more well-rounded, because not having cavalry sucks, especially when you're trying to chase down fast-moving units, right? It just sucks. Closing take, the Lizardmen are boring because they're too complete. They have elite line units, monsters, pseudo-artillery, and top-tier magic compressed decision space. If you want to add drama, add constraints or pick a faction with sharper weaknesses. This was G-Man Gaming and Reviews episode on why the Lizardmen are boring. I'd love to hear your feedback / comments on this one. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Which faction do you think is the most boring? Which faction do you think is maybe the most fun? Love to hear your comments. This was G-Man Gaming and Reviews, signing off.